3 crashes in 2 weekends has left Williams with one big problem. After falling behind schedule during the winter break, Williams were already gambling as to if they would even be ready for the first race in Bahrain. But after just about getting their cars out on track, having 3 crashes, courtesy of Alex Albon, Logan Sargent and Daniel Ricciardo, has dented not only their cars, but also dented their hopes for the 2024 season. Let's get into it. Since entering Williams as their new team boss, James Vowles has made it abundantly clear that Williams are a little behind the times when it's come to their facilities and practices. He was even quoted saying that when he stepped into the Williams headquarters for the first time, there were some elements that were 20 years out of date, pointing out that it's clear to see the investment that's been put into Williams over the last few years has been basically zero. But after a very impressive showing from the team in 2023, particularly from Alex Albon, who managed 8 points finishes, including a couple of stunning drives in Italy and Canada, dragging that team to 7th place in the constructor standings, which was top of that back of the field pack, it looked like everything was going exceptionally well for the team, and it was easy to forget that James Vowles, now assisted by Pat Fry from Alpine, were trying to completely change the foundations of the team and ripping up everything that they had back at the factory so that the team could eventually align themselves with the modern practices of other teams on the Formula One grid, which led to a few issues over the winter break. Vowles explained that over the winter, the team not only completely changed their design philosophy around the car, but hundreds of the manufacturing processes used by the Alpine team as well. And for instance, I didn't realize until now that the Williams team would sometimes machine parts from metal, even though the other teams were making the same part from carbon fiber to save money and cut corners, which was something that James Vowles would no longer allow. But these changes meant that the staff at Williams had to break old cycles of manufacture, adjust to new processes, and remove some of their old habits whilst working on the 2024 car. And when you're changing so many elements of the factory over the course of only, 8 to 10 months, with some key areas of the Williams facilities having to produce nearly 10 times the number of components that they made for the 2023 car, inevitably, it's led to some hiccups. The first signs of this were when the team didn't manage to get their car prepared for the shakedown in Silverstone. Whilst all the other teams on the grid were putting together their livery reveals and showing off their new car designs out on track using their allocated media days to dust off the cobwebs and head out into the new season, the Williams team decided to skip their media day because their car just wasn't going to be in working order by then and focus solely on getting the car prepared for the first official testing session in Bahrain. As James Vowles has explained, these changes were needed and it makes sense so that the team can move forwards in the future. I mean, previous Williams cars were built in Excel, and look at the last regulation cycle for Williams. It was an absolute nightmare. It was always going to be a difficult transition for this new look Williams team. However, the amount of disruption that it's caused to the team was way more than anyone had expected. Despite the delays though, the 2024 Williams FW46 arrived on time in Bahrain. The heroics shown by the staff, pulling all-nighters, sleeping at the factory, and finally getting the thousands of parts together to create a Formula One car had fully paid off. It's something that the team have said they never want to go through again, but they actually got a car out on track. And just looking at the results, Alex Albon has started the season pretty well, getting very close to the points in Saudi Arabia, where he finished in 11th place. And I know it's slightly frustrating because without the setbacks, if they had been able to shake down and then testing had gone a little bit smoother, maybe they would have some points by now. But the team looks set to at least battle amongst the backmarkers, which, considering the amount of setbacks they've had, is better than some of the other teams on the grid right now. And actually, now that they have updated the systems, by the time they get around to adding upgrades to this Williams car, they could be in a really strong position to improve a lot more than their rivals, because they already have parts that they wanted to bring at the beginning of the season, but they didn't have time to add, and they can keep iterating on those parts. However, the problem that they hadn't foreseen was that they expended so much time and money, remember there is a cost cap to worry about as well, just to get this first iteration of the Williams car out on track, that they hadn't had anywhere near enough time to make spare parts for the car. And I think you can see where this is going. The team had to decide which parts they would try and get away with not having at their disposal for the first few race weekends. They gambled and decided to enter the start of the 2024 season without a spare chassis, which sounds like a crazy thing to do in hindsight, but I also found out that Alpine have been running their cars without a spare chassis too. However, I'm not sure that anyone ever wants to justify themselves by comparing to what Alpine are doing behind the scenes, so we'll leave that there. And the Williams team knew that they had to do everything possible to get those cars out onto the grid in time, but any severe damage to the cars would cause a massive headache. And Williams haven't had just one incident, they've managed to have three. Alex Albon was to blame for the first. Albon lost control of his Williams on the exit of turn 6 in Melbourne before smashing into the wall on the inside of the track and rebounding across the circuit. The damage of that crash was assessed and the team realised that they couldn't continue using that chassis for the rest of the weekend, which did also lead to their first controversy of the season. With Albon's chassis out of use, the clear team number 1 was without a car for the rest of the weekend, meaning that he wouldn't be able to take part in the Grand Prix. However, with Australia looking like a really good opportunity for the Williams team to score points, we saw the team give Logan Sargent's seat to Alex for the rest of the weekend, despite the American not causing any damage to his car. Yet. Alex therefore would take part in the race, whilst Logan had to sit and watch from the sidelines. And we yet to see how this really plays out in the long run, but it can't have been nice for Logan to miss out on a Grand Prix because of his teammate's mistake. And to me, it just goes to show that Williams are desperate to keep hold of Alex Albon at literally any cost, and how Logan Sargent is almost guaranteed to be out of a seat for next season. But the impact of Albon's crash was way bigger than just the team dynamic between those two. Albon's chassis had to be rushed back to Grove and repaired by the Williams factory team before it could then be sent back out to Japan, which meant the team once again had to take their focus away from building the spare chassis and instead repair Alex Albon's used one. Which they did, and they sent it back out to the Japanese Grand Prix, but that meant going into just round 4 of the season, they still only had 2 chassis, one of which had been damaged and repaired already. To then have an even more costly weekend in Japan with not one but both of the drivers getting themselves caught up in the barriers. Logan Sargent, now driving Alex Albon's repaired chassis, just touched the grass as he rounded Dunlop Curve, which caused him to lose control of his Williams and slam into the barriers on the outside of the track. Luckily, his chassis was okay. There was a hefty amount of damage to a lot of other components, which again needed to be replaced, taking the team's attention away from making developments and that elusive spare chassis at this point to ensure that the spares of those parts were replaced before the Chinese Grand Prix. Then during the Japanese Grand Prix, going into turn 3, the third of the Williams crashes occurred, although this time the Williams drivers weren't really to blame. Alex Albon, driving the only undamaged chassis that Williams have, found himself being pushed to the right-hand side of the track by Daniel Ricciardo, with Albon eventually being squeezed so far that he had nowhere to go, and he was just clipped by the Australian, sending both cars spinning off the track. And you guessed it, possibly damaging the chassis of the Williams car, meaning they had to pick it up, send it back to Grove to be inspected and repaired, along with all of the other components that were also damaged as the Williams nestled itself into the tyre wall, meaning in 2 races with 3 crashes, just 4 rounds into the 2024 season, we have exactly the opposite of what the doctor ordered for a Williams team that was already on its knees from exhaustion after the winter break. Which then begs the question, how will this all affect a Williams team that is already struggling moving forwards for the rest of the season? And unfortunately for them, these issues have come at the worst time of the year. Not only because they don't have the spare chassis yet, but also because of the cost to the team's budget, having to get a chassis to and from the UK between each race. The grouping of the first 5 races on the calendar this season has been designed by the Formula 1 higher-ups to reduce the amount of travelling and the cost of moving the Formula 1 circus from track to track. Having Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Australia, Japan and China together meant that the teams didn't have to go back and forth from Europe between each race. Which is exactly what Williams have had to do, sending that chassis from Australia back to the UK, then to Japan, back to the UK again, and then finally to China for this weekend. It's the least cost-effective thing that they could have done during this part of the season. And that cost, along with producing all of the replacement parts required from all 3 of the crashes, is looking like it's going to cost Williams around $3 million in total, which, considering the cost cap is only $140 million for the entire season, a solid chunk has been, you could argue, wasted due to these circumstances, particularly when Vowles and the team are budgeting a huge portion of their budget to infrastructure. Thanks to the new rules around capital expenditure, Haas, Stake, RB and Williams are allowed to spend a little bit more than the rest of the grid on infrastructure due to their average finishing position in the standings over the last few years. So Williams would have wanted to put that money towards that, and Of course, all teams leave a little room in their budget to allow for crashes, but with 20 races still to go in the season, I'm not sure how much Williams will actually have left for repairs. But the bigger cost, in my opinion, will be to the team and the staff back at the factory, who have been working overtime from December all the way until now. The chassis broken by Alex Albon had to be fixed within a 2-week period so that it was back out for Japan. But it takes around 4 days for the car to get shipped all the way back to the UK, and another 4 days or so for it to get back out to Japan from the UK. So really, the staff in the factory had less than a week, which meant asking staff to once again work extra days and extra hours to pull off that insane turnaround. And they now face the exact same thing again with the other chassis that needs to come from Japan back to the UK and get back out to China before the Grand Prix weekend in Shanghai, which is also a sprint weekend, by the way, so there's the additional work to be completed for that too. I'm worried because, as Albon put it, the staff have been digging deep and producing miracles, and they can only go on like that for so long until the team just can't keep up with that frantic pace they've had to maintain in recent months. The spare chassis is still missing, and the updates that the team have been desperate to start working on have been pushed back once again, and they can't expect the car to improve when the team back at the factory have no time to develop or produce any upgrades. Although the car is better than the 2023 spec, the team find themselves at a standstill. The parts that they had delayed at the beginning of the year have only been further delayed since then. And when you stand still in Formula 1, you only end up going backwards in the long run, with Haas and RB already looking to upgrade and improve from their stronger starting position, as well as big changes coming to the Stake and Alpine cars coming soon. And Valve's 3-year process aimed at taking Williams to the next level come the regulation changes in 2026 is already having a positive effect on the team. But something had to give, and it's just unfortunate that the start of this season has seen so many crashes for the Williams drivers. The team back at the factory deserve immense credit for pushing through and performing miracles so far this season, but that does mean that they're already running on fumes, and the money for development is being wasted on flights and spare parts. I'm really worried that this horrible start to the season could end up ruining any chances of Williams progressing in 2024, with every race now causing them to take one step backwards when they were already massively behind schedule. Although having said all that, it feels difficult to say that Williams are in a bigger crisis than Alpine right now, and for more information on what's going wrong at the French team on the grid, click the link up there and I'll explain it all.